If 1,000 kings kneel and you still feel nothing, the problem isn't them. It's what you're actually looking for. The selection hall of Valen didn't just hold sound. It filtered it, turning every word into something sharper, heavier, more deliberate. As if even language had to earn the right to exist here. Rows of alien nobles stood in perfect symmetry beneath floating arcs of light, each one dressed in fabrics that adjusted their color in response to status and emotion, though most had locked theirs into confident shades that suggested certainty, which was ironic, because every single one of them had been wrong so far. At the center, elevated just enough to remind everyone of gravity's loyalty, Princess Lyra Valen sat with her back straight, hands resting lightly on the armrests grown from living crystal, her long, elegant ears angled outward in what her advisors called neutral, which in practice meant no one in the room could predict what she would do next. Ethan Cole stood near the outer ring, slightly behind a diagnostic pillar that hummed with polite disapproval at his presence. A human maintenance tech with a sleeve rolled up and a faint line of grease across his wrist, which he had tried and failed to remove with a cloth that had once been white. And he was fairly certain he was the only person in the hall who had not rehearsed a speech designed to impress a woman who had already rejected more power than most civilizations could accumulate in a century. Another suitor stepped forward, tall, composed, voice calibrated to perfection, offering alliance, fleets, shared dominion across 3 sectors, the kind of proposal that would have rewritten trade routes for decades. And Lyra listened, because she always listened, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, her expression revealing absolutely nothing until he finished. And then, with a movement so small it almost felt like a suggestion rather than an action, she tilted her head and said, "No." And the word didn't echo, it settled, like a final answer to a question no one wanted to repeat. Ethan exhaled, quietly through his nose, not because he was surprised, but because he had started to notice a pattern that no one else seemed willing to acknowledge, that every proposal in this room was built on the same assumption, that she needed more power, more protection, more control, as if offering her more of what she already had would somehow become different if phrased more elegantly. The hall shifted as the next contender prepared to speak, a subtle redistribution of attention, a recalibration of expectation, and somewhere in that movement, Lyra's gaze drifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone trained to watch her to react, but just enough to land on Ethan, and stay there a fraction longer than logic allowed. Ethan noticed, because it's hard not to notice when the most powerful person in the room looks at you like you're a variable that doesn't belong in the equation, and he made the very reasonable decision to look away immediately, because humans survive longer when they don't volunteer for situations they don't understand. Another voice began, another flawless proposal, another carefully structured future that sounded impressive and empty at the same time, and Ethan found himself thinking, with the kind of dry clarity that usually got him into trouble, that if everyone in the room kept solving the wrong problem, it didn't matter how advanced their solutions were. And that was when Lyra's ears shifted, just slightly, just enough to suggest focus. And Ethan had the uncomfortable feeling that the next mistake in this room might not belong to any of the people who had come here prepared. The next speaker did not hesitate, which was either confidence or a complete misunderstanding of how many times that exact tone had already failed today. And as his voice filled the hall with promises of strategic dominance and unified command structures, Ethan found himself counting the phrases instead of listening to them. 1. Control. 2. Expansion. 3. Loyalty framed as ownership. And by the time the man reached what was clearly meant to be his strongest point, Ethan had already predicted the ending with the kind of quiet certainty that came from fixing the same broken system too many times. Princess Lyra did not interrupt. She never interrupted. She allowed the full structure to present itself, every polished word, every carefully balanced offer. And when the silence finally returned to her, she studied him for a moment that stretched just long enough to make the entire room lean forward without realizing it. And then she gave the same answer, precise, unadorned, no. And this time the word carried a faint trace of something sharper, not anger, not even impatience, but recognition of repetition, as if she were declining not the man, but the pattern itself. A ripple moved through the gathered elites, subtle but real, the kind of shift that happens when certainty begins to erode at the edges, and Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, feeling like he had accidentally walked into a meeting where everyone was trying to solve a problem that had already been solved incorrectly several times in a row. The diagnostic pillar beside him adjusted its tone, a soft hum rising and falling as it recalibrated. Environmental data, and Ethan glanced at it briefly. Because machines were easier, machines either worked or they did not. They did not pretend that repeating the same input would eventually produce a different output. Across the hall, Lyra's gaze moved again, slower this time, deliberate in a way that suggested choice rather than drift, and it landed on Ethan with enough weight that he could almost feel the space around him reorganize, like the room had decided to acknowledge his existence all at once, which he considered deeply unnecessary. He looked over his shoulder out of habit, just to confirm there was no one more important standing behind him. But there was only the smooth curve of the wall and a maintenance panel that definitely did not outrank him. And when he looked back, she was still watching. One of her advisors leaned in slightly, speaking in a low tone that did not quite reach Ethan's ears but clearly carried urgency. And Lyra did not respond immediately, her posture unchanged, her expression controlled, but her ears shifted forward by a fraction, an adjustment so small it would have been invisible to anyone not paying attention, and Ethan, unfortunately, had nothing else to pay attention to anymore. The next candidate hesitated before stepping forward, as if the air itself had grown heavier, and Ethan felt the moment stretching in a direction that made him increasingly uncomfortable, because there is a specific kind of silence that suggests something is about to go wrong in a way that cannot be undone. And he had learned to recognize it the same way he recognized a system about to overload, not by noise, but by the absence of it. He exhaled, quietly, telling himself to stay exactly where he was, to let professionals handle whatever this was, to remember that he was here to fix a calibration issue. In a secondary grid that no one else had time for, not to become part of a royal selection process that clearly did not include humans in any official capacity. And for a moment, that plan held, right up until Lyra shifted her attention away from the next speaker before he could even begin and said, without raising her voice, without signaling anyone else, "You." And the word did not need volume. It carried direction, and every eye in the hall followed it straight to Ethan Cole, who had just become, quite unintentionally, the next variable in a system that had rejected everything else. For a moment, Ethan was certain she was pointing at someone else, which would have been both logical and deeply preferable. So he made the mistake of glancing to his left, then to his right, hoping to find a more qualified target, someone with medals, or a fleet, or at least a speech prepared. But the space around him had already cleared in that subtle, respectful way crowds make when something important is about to happen, and the absence of alternatives felt uncomfortably definitive. He straightened slowly, wiping his hand against his pants out of habit rather than strategy, and took a step forward because not stepping forward seemed like a worse decision, and the hall responded immediately, attention tightening, conversations that had not even begun dissolving before they could exist. Princess Lyra did not repeat herself. She did not need to. Her gaze remained fixed on him with a level of focus that suggested he had just become relevant in a way no one had planned for, and as Ethan approached the center, he became acutely aware of the contrast, the polished precision of everyone else compared to the very practical reality of a man who had been fixing a calibration issue less than 10 minutes ago. He stopped at what felt like the correct distance, which was not a measurement he had ever been trained for, and inclined his head slightly, because that seemed respectful without committing to anything more complicated. And for a brief second, nothing happened, which in this room meant everything was happening. Lyra studied him in silence, not evaluating in the way she had evaluated the others, not measuring assets or projecting outcomes, but looking, as if trying to align him with something that did not quite match any existing category. And Ethan resisted the urge to speak first, mostly because he had no idea what the correct first sentence would be in a situation where a princess who had just rejected an entire room full of elites had decided to redirect her attention toward him. One of the advisors shifted behind her, a small movement, quickly controlled, but enough to suggest that this deviation was not part of the expected sequence. And the system above them, the layered arcs of light that monitored and recorded every formal interaction, adjusted their glow by a fraction, as if recalibrating for a scenario they had not been programmed to prioritize. Lyra tilted her head slightly, her ears angling forward in a way that carried more intention than any spoken command, and she asked, her voice calm, precise, "You are not here to propose." And it was not a question, not exactly. More like an observation that expected confirmation. Ethan exhaled softly, because at least that part was easy. "No," he said, and then, because silence stretched in a way that suggested more was required, he added, "I am here to fix a secondary grid imbalance in your lower sector," which was technically true and entirely irrelevant to the current situation. A faint ripple moved through the room, not laughter, but something adjacent to it, the recognition of an answer that did not fit the script, and for the first time since he had stepped forward, Ethan noticed a change in Lyra's expression, not a smile, not even close, but a softening at the edges, as if the predictability of the room had been interrupted in a way she did not immediately dislike. She leaned forward slightly, the movement small but unmistakably intentional, and said, "Then you see more than most." And Ethan, who had spent most of his life avoiding being noticed, had the distinct and uncomfortable realization that whatever came next would not be something he could fix with a wrench or a diagnostic scan, and that the safest answer available to him had just stopped being safe the moment she decided he was worth asking. The silence did not break, it deepened, the kind that settles into the structure of a room and makes every movement feel like a decision, and Ethan realized with a slow, uncomfortable clarity that there was no correct answer waiting for him, only choices that would echo differently depending on how honest he was willing to be. He shifted his weight slightly, aware that every eye in the hall was now measuring him without understanding what they were measuring, and he glanced briefly at the floor, not out of submission, but because it gave him half a second to think, which was more time than most people in this room had been given. "I fix things," he said finally, his voice even, not loud, but clear enough that the room did not have to lean in to hear him. Systems, mostly. Things that stopped working the way they were designed to. And he paused, not for effect, but because he was deciding whether to continue down a path that already felt like a mistake. And this one, he added, gesturing lightly toward the surrounding hall, toward the candidates, toward the entire process without directly pointing at any one person, does not look broken, but it keeps producing the same result. A faint shift moved through the crowd, sharper this time, less controlled, because this was not how this moment was supposed to unfold. One of the advisors stepped forward a fraction, enough to signal interruption, but Lyra raised a single finger, not quickly, not forcefully, just enough to stop the motion before it became action, and the advisor froze in place as if the gesture had rewritten his instructions. Lyra's gaze did not leave Ethan, her focus narrowing in a way that felt less like scrutiny and more like alignment, as if she were adjusting something internal to better understand what he was saying, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, quieter, but heavier. "Explain." And the word landed between them with more weight than any of the proposals that had come before. Ethan exhaled slowly, because this was the part where people expected something impressive, something structured, something worthy of the setting, and all he had was a thought that had not been filtered through ceremony. "They are all offering you more of what you already have," he said, choosing his words carefully, not because they were delicate, but because they were simple. "More control, more reach, more ways to win." He shrugged slightly, a human gesture that felt almost out of place here. "But you are not rejecting them because they are weak." He met her gaze directly now. "Because avoiding it would only make this worse. You are rejecting them because they are all solving the wrong problem." The room reacted before anyone spoke. A tightening, a subtle shift in posture, the collective recognition that something had just been said that did not belong to the established order. Above them, the light arcs adjusted again, their glow flickering by a fraction of a degree, as if the system itself was recalculating the parameters of the interaction, and for a brief moment, the entire hall felt suspended between what it had been and what it was becoming. Lyra leaned forward just slightly, her ears angled forward now, no longer neutral, no longer unreadable, and there was something in her expression that had not been there before, not softness, not yet, but the absence of dismissal. "And what?" she asked, her voice steady, controlled, but edged with something sharper. Something closer to curiosity than authority is the correct problem, and Ethan, who had successfully avoided being important for most of his life, realized that whatever he said next would not just answer her question, it would redefine the entire room and possibly everything that came after. The question did not rush him. It waited, heavy and patient, as if even time understood that the next answer would matter more than anything that had been said before, and Ethan found himself staring at Princess Lyra not as a ruler, not as a symbol, but as a system he had been trying to understand since the moment he noticed the pattern, and for the first time, he stopped thinking about what he should say and focused on what was actually there. He took a slow breath, not dramatic, just enough to keep his thoughts from tangling. "You are not looking for someone who can win," he said, his voice steady, grounded in the same tone he used when explaining something simple to someone who expected it to be complicated. "You already know how to do that." A faint shift moved through the room, subtle but sharper than before, because this was no longer abstract. This was direct. He continued before the moment could collapse under its own weight. "You are looking for someone who will not turn everything into something that needs to be controlled." And this time, the reaction was not just in posture or silence, it was in the absence of interruption, even from those who clearly wanted to object. Above them, the light arcs dimmed slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to suggest the system had entered a different mode, one that prioritized observation over protocol. Lyra did not speak, but her focus intensified, her ears angled forward with a precision that made it clear she was no longer evaluating a candidate. She was listening to something she had not heard before. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, grounding himself in something familiar. "Every proposal here assumes that your world needs to be expanded, defended, or managed." He gestured lightly, not dismissively, but accurately. "But none of them ask what happens when nothing is wrong." The words hung in the air, not loud, but impossible to ignore, and for a moment, even the systems that governed the room seemed to hesitate, as if recalculating the relevance of a scenario they had never prioritized. One of the elites took a step forward, unable to hold back any longer, but stopped when Lyra did not even glance in his direction, her attention locked entirely on Ethan, and that absence of acknowledgement carried more authority than any command. Ethan let out a quiet breath, the kind that comes from realizing you have already gone too far to turn back. "The correct problem," he said, meeting her gaze fully now, "is not how to give you more power." His tone did not change, but the room did, tightening, focusing, reacting without movement. "It is whether anyone here understands when you do not need it." And this time, the silence that followed was different, not empty, not waiting, but full, as if something had just aligned in a way that made everything else feel slightly off. Lyra's expression shifted, not visibly to most, but enough that the edges of her composure softened by a degree so small it could be mistaken for nothing. Except it was not nothing. It was the first break in a pattern that had held for longer than anyone in the room could remember, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before, but carried more weight than any declaration made that day. "And you," she said slowly, deliberately, as if testing the shape of the thought as she formed it, "would know when that is." And Ethan, who had spent most of his life avoiding answers that made him responsible for anything beyond what he could fix with his hands, gave the only response that felt honest. "I would know when to stop trying to fix something that is not broken." And for the first time since the selection began, Princess Lyra did not look like she was deciding between options. She looked like she had just found something no one else had even realized they were missing. No one moved, not because they were instructed to, but because movement no longer felt appropriate in a room that had just shifted its own definition of importance. And Ethan became aware of something subtle but unmistakable. The attention was no longer divided among dozens of candidates. It had collapsed entirely onto a single point, and that point was him. Princess Lyra did not look away. She did not return to her elevated stillness. Instead, she rose, not abruptly, not with ceremony, but with a controlled motion that carried more weight than any announcement. And as she stood, the entire hall adjusted around her, the light arcs dimming slightly, as if acknowledging a transition that had not been formally declared. Ethan resisted the instinct to step back, which he identified as a very human survival response that would probably send the wrong signal here. So he stayed where he was, hands relaxed at his sides, posture neutral, doing his best to look like a man who had not just disrupted a process that had likely been in place longer than his entire species had been traveling between stars. Lyra stepped down from the elevated platform, each movement precise, unhurried, closing the distance between them in a way that made the rest of the room feel increasingly irrelevant. And with each step, the silence followed her, not empty, not uncertain, but focused, as if the entire environment had decided to observe rather than interfere. She stopped in front of him, close enough now that Ethan could see the fine details in her expression, the slight tension at the edges of control, the way her ears held forward without shifting, signaling a level of attention that went beyond evaluation. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, which felt less like hesitation and more like alignment, as if something unseen had finally settled into place. Behind them, one of the senior advisors took a breath, clearly preparing to reassert structure. But before a single word could form, the system overhead emitted a soft tonal shift, a recalibration signal, and then went quiet again, as if even the protocols had decided this moment did not belong to them. Lyra's gaze remained steady on Ethan as she said, her voice low, measured, carrying a clarity that did not require volume. Everyone here tried to become what they thought I needed. And the statement was not criticism, not praise, simply fact, delivered with the weight of someone who had heard it too many times. You did not, she added, and there was something new in the way she said it. Not surprise, not exactly, but recognition of difference. Ethan let out a small breath, the kind that usually came before admitting something mildly inconvenient. I was not trying to, he said honestly, and the simplicity of it seemed to land harder than anything else he had said so far. A faint shift moved through Lyra's expression, not a smile, not yet, but the absence of distance, the first indication that she was no longer observing him as an anomaly, but as a presence she was choosing to engage with. She studied him for another second, longer than any formal exchange would allow, and then she asked, quietly, if you were to propose, and the word carried a different weight here, stripped of performance, reduced to intent, what would you offer? And the question did not feel like a test. It felt like an opening. Ethan blinked once, because that was not where he expected this to go, and he glanced briefly at the surrounding hall, at the silent rows of individuals who had arrived with certainty and were now watching something they did not understand unfold in real time. And then he looked back at her, because avoiding that would no longer help, and he said, with the same grounded tone he had used from the beginning, nothing you do not already have. And the words did not echo, they settled, deliberate and unembellished. And for the first time since the selection had begun, the question was no longer what she would choose, but why she would choose at all. The words did not create noise, they removed it, as if everything else in the hall had suddenly become unnecessary. And for a moment, even the systems embedded in the walls seemed to hesitate, holding their function in suspension while something less measurable took priority. Princess Lyra did not respond immediately, and that pause carried more weight than any reaction could have, because it was not dismissal, it was consideration, real and unguarded in a way no one in the room had ever seen from her before. Ethan remained still, not because he was confident, but because he understood that adding anything now would only dilute what had already been said, and for the first time since he stepped forward, he was not trying to navigate the situation, he was simply present in it. Lyra's gaze searched his face, not for weakness, not for advantage, but for consistency, as if she were testing whether the simplicity of his answer could hold under pressure. And when she spoke, her voice was quieter than before, but sharper, more precise. Then why remain? She asked. And the question cut cleanly through the silence, not as a challenge, but as a genuine inquiry that no one else had thought to ask. Ethan exhaled softly, because that was the part no one ever included in proposals, the part that did not translate into power or status or measurable gain. Because leaving would not solve anything, he said, and the honesty of it settled into the room with a different kind of weight, less dramatic, more permanent. And staying does not require me to become something I am not, he added, his tone unchanged, steady, grounded in the same logic he had followed from the beginning. A subtle shift passed through Lyra's expression, not visible to most, but enough to alter the way she held herself, the distance between ruler and individual narrowing by a degree that redefined the entire interaction. Behind them, the gathered elites remained silent, not out of respect, but because the framework they relied on no longer applied, and without that structure, they had nothing to interrupt with. The light arcs above dimmed further, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that the room itself had accepted the shift, that whatever was happening now existed outside the expected parameters of the selection. Lyra took a small step closer, close enough that the formality of distance no longer separated them, and for the first time, her presence felt less like something to be endured and more like something that was choosing to remain, and that difference changed everything. She studied him for another second, longer than any protocol would allow, and then she said, slowly, deliberately, as if placing each word exactly where it belonged, "You offer nothing I lack." And the statement could have been rejection, could have ended everything in a single breath, but it did not carry that tone. It carried something else, something that made the room lean in without realizing it. And yet, she continued, her voice softening by a fraction, not enough to weaken it, but enough to change its direction. "You are the only one who has not tried to take something from me in the process." And that was the moment the balance shifted completely, not with force, not with declaration, but with recognition, the kind that does not need to be explained to be understood. Ethan felt it, not as pressure, but as clarity. The sense that whatever came next would not be about competing with anyone else in the room, because the competition had already ended without anyone formally acknowledging it. And when Lyra lifted her hand slightly, not commanding, not signaling, simply reaching a fraction closer than before, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for a decision that no longer belonged to tradition, but to something far more difficult to predict. Her hand did not command. It paused, suspended between intention and action, as if even she was aware that crossing that last fraction of distance would turn something unspoken into something real. And for the first time since the selection began, Princess Lyra hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but because the moment itself had no precedent. Ethan noticed, not the gesture itself, but the restraint behind it, the deliberate control of someone who had never needed to question a decision before. And it shifted something in his understanding, because this was not about choosing a candidate anymore. This was about choosing a direction. The hall remained perfectly still, the kind of stillness that was no longer formal but absolute, where even the systems embedded in the walls had reduced their output to near silence, as if the architecture itself had decided observation was more important than function. Lyra lowered her hand slightly, not withdrawing, but adjusting, recalibrating the moment rather than ending it. And when she spoke, her voice carried a different weight, not authority, not distance, but something closer to admission. "They all tried to stand above me," she said, her gaze never leaving Ethan, or beside me. A faint shift passed through her expression, subtle but undeniable. None of them understood what it means to stand with nothing to prove, and the words did not accuse, they clarified, stripping away the layers that had defined the selection until only something essential remained. Ethan exhaled quietly, because that was the part no one prepared for, the part where the situation stopped being theoretical and became personal, and he resisted the instinct to respond immediately, not because he lacked an answer, but because he understood that rushing it would change its meaning. Behind them, a low ripple of tension moved through the gathered elites, not loud, not disruptive, but present, the collective realization that the structure they relied on had already dissolved and nothing had replaced it yet. Lyra took another small step forward, closing the distance fully now, not in a way that imposed, but in a way that removed the last barrier between them, and for a brief moment, the scale of the room disappeared, leaving only two individuals standing in a space that no longer belonged to protocol. "If you remain," she said, and the phrasing was deliberate, not command, not request, but possibility. "You will not be given a title to define you." Her tone remained calm, but there was a quiet intensity beneath it now, something that suggested this mattered in a way no formal offer ever had. "You will not be measured against expectations you did not choose, and the statement hung in the air, not as a warning, but as a condition that removed everything else. Ethan let out a breath that almost became a quiet laugh, the kind that appears when something unexpectedly makes sense. "That sounds familiar," he said, his voice steady, grounded, the same dry edge present even now. "I have been avoiding titles for most of my life." And for the first time, the corner of Lyra's expression shifted in a way that could almost be called amusement, though it was restrained, controlled, like everything else about her. The silence that followed was no longer tense. It was settled, as if the decision had already been made somewhere beneath the surface and was simply waiting to be acknowledged. Lyra's gaze softened by a fraction, not enough to lose its precision, but enough to change its intent, and when she spoke again, it was no longer to the room, no longer to the system, but to him. "Then you understand," she said quietly, and in that moment, the selection, with all its rules and expectations and carefully constructed outcomes, ceased to exist as anything more than a formality that had already been outgrown. The moment did not announce itself. It settled, quiet and irreversible, like something the room had been waiting for without realizing it. And Princess Lyra straightened slightly, not returning to distance, but stepping fully into decision, her presence no longer divided between evaluation and possibility, but aligned with a single, clear direction. The light arcs above shifted once more, not flickering this time, but stabilizing, as if the system had finally found a state it could recognize, even if it had not been designed for it. And across the hall, the gathered elites remained frozen in a silence that was no longer anticipation, but confirmation, the understanding that whatever outcome they had expected had already passed them by. Lyra's gaze remained on Ethan, steady, unbroken, and when she spoke, her voice carried not just authority, but finality, the kind that does not need reinforcement. "This selection is concluded," and the words moved through the hall without resistance. Not because they were loud, but because they were absolute. A subtle shift followed, the kind that ripples through a system when a process terminates. Advisors straightening, protocols attempting to reassert themselves, but none of it reached the center, where the decision had already been made. Ethan blinked once, the only outward sign that he was processing the fact that something very large had just ended in a way that felt almost understated, and he let out a quiet breath, because there was no version of this situation where he had expected to still be standing here at the end of it. Lyra stepped closer, not by much, but enough to remove any remaining ambiguity, and for a moment, she simply looked at him, not as a ruler confirming a choice, but as someone acknowledging the reality of it. And then she said, softer now, but no less certain, "You remain," and the phrasing was deliberate, not an order, not a question, but a recognition of something already decided. Ethan glanced briefly toward the edges of the hall, at the silent rows of individuals who had arrived with certainty and were now left with something else entirely, and then back to her, because whatever came next no longer involved them. And he gave a small nod, not dramatic, not formal, just honest. "All right," he said, and the simplicity of it seemed to fit the moment better than anything more elaborate could have. A faint shift touched Lyra's expression again, that almost smile that never fully formed, restrained, controlled, but undeniably present now. And she turned slightly, not away from him, but toward the hall, acknowledging its existence again without returning to it. "Prepare the lower sector," she said calmly, her tone returning to something closer to command, though it carried a different weight now, less distant, more grounded. "He will require access," and the statement landed like a declaration that rewrote more than just logistics. The advisors hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding, not because they did not understand, but because they understood too well what had just changed, and then they moved, efficiently, precisely, the system rebuilding itself around a new center. Ethan exhaled softly, glancing upward at the now steady light arcs. "I think I just changed your entire process," he said, half to himself, the dry edge still present, still grounding him in something familiar, and Lyra's gaze returned to him, steady, focused, with that same quiet intensity that had started all of this. "No," she said, and for the first time, there was something unmistakably certain in the way her expression settled, something that went beyond decision and into recognition. You revealed it. And as the hall slowly resumed movement around them, the silence that had once belonged to expectation transformed into something else entirely. Not emptiness, not tension, but the quiet acknowledgement that the moment had not just ended. It had redefined everything that would come after.